The MHRA does not regulate surgical procedures. If a procedure involves the use of a particular medical device, then the device itself will be regulated. And the responsibility for advising health professionals on surgical procedures rests with NICE through its Interventional Procedures Advisory Committee, IPAC. And over the past 18 years, IPAC has published over 600 pieces of guidance on the use of interventional procedures. The medical devices are very different from pharmaceuticals, and as a clinical pharmacologist, I recognize that very much. Firstly, the number of devices on the market is massive. There are estimated to be more than 500,000 medical devices on the EU market as a whole, and at least 100,000 on the UK market, compared, for example, of 15,000 pharmaceuticals. Secondly, medical devices range from simple tongue depressors at the one hand to implantable defibrillators at the other. And thirdly, unlike pharmaceuticals, as we've already been talking about, medical devices tend not to be static. If a manufacturer of a pharmaceutical inserts a methyl or hydroxyl group or other molecule, it's a new product. But manufacturers' devices often make relatively modest changes during the product life cycle. The arrangements for the regulation of medical devices in the EU were introduced as directives, not regulations, but as directives in the 1990s. The 1990 directive was concerned with implantable active devices. The 93 directive covered most other medical devices, and the 1998 directive covered in vitro diagnostic medical devices. Under the arrangements described in the arrangements described in these directives, medical device manufacturers were required to retain a CE mark from a notified body before being allowed to place their product on the EU market. More on notified bodies in a moment. In granting CE marks, the directives tried to take a risk-based approach with Class 1 devices, such as tongue depressors, posing any minimal risk, and Class 3 devices, such as implantable defibrillators, posing a potentially high or very high risk. The directives allowed manufacturers to self-certify Class 1 products, but Class 2A, 2B, and 3 were required to be certified by notified bodies. Why it's 1, 2A, 2B, and 3, God knows, I have no idea. It could be 1, 2, 3, and 4 would be just as sensible, but never mind. Now, notified bodies. Notified bodies are organizations that have the responsibility to assess whether manufacturers and their medical devices meet the requirements as set out in the relevant legislation. Before becoming a notified body, the organization must obtain designation by what is known as the designating authority of one of the EU member states' so-called competent authorities. In the UK, the designating authority for notified bodies is the MHRA. Once designated, notified bodies are regularly audited by the designating authority, accompanied by representatives from 2 other EU designating authorities. These audits include both announced and unannounced inspections. Where an audit shows serious deficiencies that have not or cannot be adequately addressed, a notified body can be de-designated. 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, there was increasing recognition that the medical devices directives of the 1990s were no longer fit for purpose. First, as a result of the expansion of the EU, there were divergent interpretations of the directives between member states. And as I'm sure you're aware, a directive has to be put into national law, whereas I suppose a regulation becomes national law in each member state the moment it's passed. Secondly, with the evolution of technology, significant changes that were not foreseeable at the time of the original directives were introduced, and changes were inevitable. And this particularly applies to software. Thirdly, high-profile incidents, including for PIP breast implants, metal-on-metal hip replacements, highlighted the need for traceability, better coordination of vigilance activity, and better clinical evidence of efficacy and safety. Fourth, there was minimal regulation, in fact, of in vitro diagnostics. and therefore a new regulation, a regulation covering medical devices and diagnostics were therefore introduced. The general features of the 2017 changes were, firstly, the 3 directives of the 1990s were replaced by 2 regulations. One covers medical devices and the other in vitro diagnostics. Because these are regulations, it is anticipated that the problems of divergent interpretation of the old directives will disappear. Second, there would be reinforced conformity assessment, cementing recent requirements for joint inspections and unannounced audits. Thirdly, greater emphasis on supply chain traceability. And fourthly, enhanced market surveillance by authorities. There are 7 key components to these regulations. First, enhanced pre-market scrutiny, novel and higher risk devices being subject to additional clinical reviews by expert panels. Secondly, the establishment of a centralized European database to capture data on CE certificates, incidents, clinical investigations, and market surveillance. Third, the introduction of a unique device identifier, so-called UDI, so that each device can be tracked and traced to the patient. Fourthly, the classification of software will now be linked to risk classification. Fifthly, there are clearer obligations for competent authorities to undertake inspections of manufacturing and clinical investigation sites. Sixthly, there will be a new risk classification rules for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. And finally, there'll be more rigorous post-market surveillance and vigilance. A little bit more about software. Forms of software with a medical use for individual patients will require a CE mark, and some examples are shown here. They include software that can diagnose skin tumors, drug dosage, individual patient drug dosage calculators, and software that specifically magnifies text for people with visual impairment. Other forms of software that are not intended to provide direct clinical care to individual patients will not require a CE mark, and some examples are shown here. They say software that records images of skin lesions that have already been assessed by a clinician, software that monitors fitness, overall health or well-being, or a general purpose image intensifier and magnifier. Software intended to provide information which is used to make decisions for diagnostic or therapeutic purposes will in future be Class 2, unless they have such decisions have an impact that may cause death or irreversible deterioration of a person's health, in which case they'll be Class 3, or serious deterioration of a person's health or surgical intervention, in which case Class 2B. Software intended to monitor physiological processes will be classified as 2A, unless it is intended for monitoring of vital physiological parameters and where the nature of variations of those parameters are such that it could result in immediate danger to the patient, in which case it will be classified as Class 2B. All other software is Class 1. It is worth remembering that under the previous direction, almost all software was Class 1, so the new arrangements will provide, we hope, much more stringent oversight. These arrangements will inevitably take time to be implemented, not least because all existing medical devices and in vitro diagnostics will have to be re-evaluated. In other words, there's no grandfathering clauses of existing devices on the market. So the new regulations came into force on the 25th of May 2017. For the medical device, the date of application is 2020. And for in vitro diagnostic regulation, the date of application is 2022. If I'd been giving this talk 2 years ago, that would have been my last slide. But what will happen after the 29th of March? What I hope is that we can negotiate a mutual recognition agreement with the EU27 that allows the UK to recognise CE marks and the EU to recognise whatever a UK mark is to be called. That way, both patients in both the EU and the UK would benefit from each other's medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. And it's not a big ask. After all, Australia, Turkey, have mutual recognition agreements with the EU, so why not? Why not the UK? So on that optimistic note, I will finish. Thank you.